Hello and welcome tonight to the Insights virtual lecture, which is entitled New Voices on Science, Agriculture and Engineering. I am Dr. Phil Lord and I am the Dean of Postgraduate Research for the Science and Engineering faculty at Newcastle. So postgraduate researchers are a significant part of our research base in the UK. They underpin much of the work that the university does and contribute towards the development of knowledge that is a key role of universities in our society. While people do PhDs for many different reasons, many are earlier in their careers and they're going to use their technical abilities to help to transform our countries, our societies and our lives for the better, both now and for many years into the future. We have three speakers tonight who do research with this capacity for transformational change. Annachiara Scalzone, Beth and Daryl Hughes, who are researching different kinds of model for applications to therapeutics, emergency evacuation and the impact of climate change. We've chosen their research by public vote, so we'd like to thank them for putting themselves forward and agreeing to speak, as well as to all of those who chose to vote. I'm very much looking forward to hearing about their interesting and compelling research tonight, and I hope that you are too. I will be back after the lecture for a live question and answer session with the speakers. If you'd like to submit a question, you may do so via the YouTube live chat box on your screen or via Twitter at InsightsNCL. I hope you enjoy the lectures. Thanks again to the speakers and to you for coming.
Hi everyone, my name is Annachiara Scalzone and I'm a PhD student in bioengineering. I'm very glad I got the opportunity to give this more virtual lecture about my work. My research mainly deals with the manufacturing and engineering of osteochondral tissue models, both in healthy and pathological state, in order to study the osteoarthritis disease progression for future therapeutic treatment, because there is still a lot of unknowledge in this field. First of all, let's introduce the subject of this talk. With the term osteochondral tissue, we are referring to the compartment of the human joints which comprise both the articular cartilage and subchondral bone. And these include diarthrodal joints such as the knee or the hip. Articular cartilage is a highly specialized soft tissue which provides a smooth and lubricated surface for the articulation, and it facilitates the transmissions of the load. While the subchondral bone is a hard tissue which provides underlying support for the articular cartilage, acting as a mechanical support for the whole joint. One of the main orthopedic concerns is about damages to the osteochondral tissue due to the osteoarthritis disease. And this is the pathological condition I'm focusing on in my PhD research. This disease is principally characterized by the degeneration of the articular cartilage component of the joint with accompanying subchondral bone lesions. It causes the tissue remodeling and the loss of the tissue structure, change in the bone and the deterioration of the tissue that holds together the joint, and it also causes inflammation of the joint lining. All this results in the malfunction of the affected joint, pain and stiffness of the whole joint, and at the most severe stage, it leads to disability. Being the most common musculoskeletal disorder, osteoarthritis affects up to 12% of the global population, and we're talking about around 303 million people, mainly female. The burden associated with this disease is increasing worldwide, and it represents a major public health challenge for the coming decades. In fact, just for example, in the UK, it has been discovered a doubling of the osteoarthritis-associated cost over the last 10 years. There are different treatment strategies for this disease. Non-surgical treatments are recommended when the disease is at a mild stage, and these include the administration of anti-inflammatory drugs or physical activity. When the disease reaches a severe stage, surgical treatments are necessary, for example, the total joint or total hip replacement with prosthesis. Beyond this conventional medical and surgical option, there have been introduced in the last around 25 years alternative techniques, and these fall into the regenerative medicine field. With this term, we are talking about a branch of medicine and a branch of engineering that develops methodology to regrow, repair, or replace damaged or diseased cells, organ, or tissue. Regenerative medicine includes even the production of artificial organs and artificial tissues. And here it comes the inspiration of my work. In particular, the main problem my research is based on is that up to today, there are still a lot of uncertainties about a long-term treatment for osteoarthritic joints. My PhD research aims to develop some process for producing a healthy pathological model representative of the osteochondral tissue and to use this model for testing novel therapeutic treatments. Indeed, the development of reliable osteochondral tissue models are vital in increasing our understanding in the tissue itself biology and tissue itself physiology, and this could help in advancing the research into the causes of the osteoarthritis disease at an early stage for future therapeutic investigations. Then the challenges faced by my research are how to obtain a predictive and reliable model, and how could I recapitulate the native tissue architecture. To this aim, I used a novel technology that is called biofabrication, and this technology allows to combine different materials for hard, that in my case is bone, and soft, that in my case is cartilage, tissues. You can even combine different cell type and different biological factor in a predefined pattern. It is important, first of all, to take into consideration that osteochondral tissue is structurally very complex because it is made of main 4 different zones, which are superficial, transitional deep zone, and subchondral bone. All these zones are different between each other for the extracellular matrix composition, organization, and also for the cells organization, cells shape and morphology, and cells behavior. For example, we have in the superficial zone, the cells are elongated, organized alongside these collagen fibers, that is one of the main elements of the articular cartilage, while in the deep zone, the cells, that are the chondrocytes, are organized in these kind of channels separated by these collagen fibers. Each zone plays a different role in contributing to the overall functional properties of the osteochondral tissue. Then it's very important to reproduce this native environment in order to have a model that is expressing the real cell's behavior and that is functional. In fact, the problem up to date is that the models usually are based on a homogeneous composition and homogeneous organization that is not representing the native reality. To this aim, what I did is to study each different zone of this osteochondral tissue and to manufacture each zone, characterize each zone. For that, I use this tool, this bioprinter. This is the name, Rocket in Vivo bioprinter. This printer has a head for extruding plastic, let's say plastic polymer that change their shape with the temperature, high temperature, very high temperature. And this is used mainly for hard tissue. In my case, I use for the bone this head. While this other head, that is called a biodispenser, is mainly used for cells embedded solutions that are called hydrogel, which are 3D water-swollen polymeric network that resemble the articular cartilage composition and articular cartilage morphology. So I used this head on the other side for the articular cartilage side. For subchondral bone, I extruded with the printer this thermoplastic polymer called polylactic acid to produce a grid. and the idea is to mimic the subchondral bone structure. Here I see the stem cells, which are the cells usually found in our native homologous zone, and these cells showed good viability, as you can see that in the green dot are the live cells, and this means that this material was not toxic. After that, I studied the bone tissue production, so to see if the cells in this environment are producing bone. As you can see here, after 21 days of culture, the cells started to deposit calcium. The calcium is the main element of bone. So this was a very successful result, showing that we obtained a successful subchondral tissue reproduction. After that, I focused on the deep layer of cartilage. Here, it was manufactured a multi-channel structure, used a nature-derived hydrogel. Here, the idea was to mimic this column within which the chondrocytes, that are the cells of cartilage, organize themselves when they are in vivo. In fact, what we can see here in this image, so here in a hole, you can see how the cells organize themselves. Again, and here you can see the cells morphology down in the in this other image. After that, I moved towards the middle layer of the articular cartilage. So for the middle layer of articular cartilage, I used a bioprinting technique, in particular a nature-inspired strategy combining a natural hydrogel with Manuka honey, because the Manuka honey has antibacterial properties, and the combination of Manuka honey and this hydrogel reproduced the elastic and lubricated nature of the articular cartilage. Here you can see the cells organization within this hydrogel in this video, producing how the cells are mainly organized in the middle zone of the cartilage. And even here, again, the cells morphology. Finally, I realized, and I'm realizing, let's say, this 3D in vitro model of the osteochondral tissue using a 4-zone construct, where each layer is being singularly manufactured in a way to mimic the in vivo environment to predict the cell's fate and the cell's behavior. This bioprinter was a very good instrument in order to exploit different manufacturing technology with different material in different cells based on the different tissue zones. And currently I'm working on the obtainment of an osteoarthritic model starting from the healthy one to study the disease progression, the osteoarthritis progression for future therapeutic analysis. I want to thank you all for your attention, and I want to thank the people that took part in this job, that are mainly my supervisor and people that took part in the different side of the zonal cartilage from Italy.
Welcome to this Insights lecture on the development of realistic human behaviours for evacuation simulations. My research is focused on improving the simulation of evacuations by including more realistic human behaviour. This lecture will first look at why this type of research is important, then look at how my approach is different to others, and then finally look at the results I've achieved. But firstly, I want you to imagine yourself in a disaster event. This might be a wildfire or flooding or even a terrorist attack. What decisions might you make? For some people, you might collect together all of your possessions. For others, you'll be natural-born leaders and take charge of the situation. Some people will freeze to the spot, literally unable to move. The majority of people will form a large crowd and follow everyone else. Some people will be terrified and run away, and others will be able to take stock of the situation, consider all the options, and then choose the safest route. What I'm trying to highlight to you is there's lots of different behaviours and lots of different decisions that could be made. And if we want our simulation of evacuations to be realistic, we need to accurately represent these behaviours. And for some people, these disasters are a reality. We regularly see hazard events within the newspapers. And for communities across the globe, the impacts of these events are devastating. And we can quantify this. Over an 11-year period, there was 1.1 million fatalities, with some single events killing over 250,000 people. 2.7 billion people were affected, and $1.3 trillion worth of financial damage was caused. So we really need to reduce the suffering for these communities and to do whatever we can to improve the situation. And one way we can do this is through the use of the disaster management cycle. So if we were to take a storm, the first phase of this would be the preparation. So we would issue a storm warning, and this would allow our communities to prepare. So people might move furniture upstairs, or they might choose to evacuate. Then the event occurs and the flooding happens. And then we move into the response phase. So this is the emergency part of the scenario. Here we might need to rescue people who couldn't evacuate previously, and we also need to meet the basic needs of the community, such as clean water, access to food, and access to medicine. Once we've done this, we then enter the recovery phase, and this is restoring our homes, rebuilding roads, maybe even reconstructing bridges. And after we've done this, we move into the final stage, which is the mitigation stage. And this is where we can build capacity in the system and think, if this event occurs again, what would we do differently? So for some of this, it will be building hard mitigation measures, such as building a flood defence. And in other ways, it's thinking about our plans and preparations. How can we do this differently? What can we improve for next time? And once we've created those plans, we need to test them. So here in the UK, we do this in one of two ways. In the top photographs, you can see them carrying out tabletop exercises. So this is when a group meets together and they work through the scenario going, we could do option A or we could do option B until they've reached the end. And often this is a really unrealistic interpretation of what would happen. And the alternative to this, as you can see in the bottom photographs, is real life simulation. And this is great for our emergency services personnel. They can test out their plans and protocols and see what would happen. But it's very cost and resource intensive. And in both options, we don't consider the general public. We don't consider what their behaviours might be and how they might impact our plans. So an alternative to this is to use computational simulation. So if you look in the top screenshot, this is a model that currently exists of some escalators. And here you'll see that everyone has got very rigid lines. They're walking together, often at very similar speeds. And then in the bottom screenshot, this is a different model that currently exists of a bus terminal. Here you can see there's very high compliance. Everyone uses the pavement or crosses on the pedestrian crossing. And again, they're all using the same walking speeds. So what's happened is these models have become very generic and they've had to oversimplify the problem. And this means that the behaviour they include isn't very representative. It's not what we'd expect. And often they haven't validated their models. So they haven't gone out and looked in real life if the model matches with what we'd expect to happen. So effectively what they've done is reduce humans to cogs in a system rather than these individual people who are capable of making their own decisions. And any of us could sit in a cafe and watch a street, and then we would see that there are differences in people's behaviour. We'd notice that people walk at different speeds, and that's affected by their age and their gender and how fit they are. You'd also notice that people don't just walk in straight lines, people weave and meander through the crowd. And those changes of direction aren't just people bumping into one another, it's anticipating the scenario and moving around someone. People also have dynamic route choice, so they'll look ahead and see that there's congestion and choose an alternative street. And finally, people walk in groups, not just as individuals. And it's these different behaviours that will help us give us a more realistic evacuation simulation. So we need to include these within our models. So that's what I've attempted to do. So firstly, by looking at a city centre, here using Newcastle, and I had to define some variables that would help me capture those different behaviour types. So firstly, I included population demographics, which allowed me to have different types of people in the model. And from this, it meant I could vary their walking speeds based on their age, their gender, and how fit they were. I also included different group sizes, so people didn't just walk as an individual. And from this, it meant I could apply a walking speed ratio, which effectively said, as the group size increased, the walking speed decreased. And then finally, including a total population size, so I could vary how busy or quiet the city centre was. And this was really good at looking at a bigger problem and looking at a large area, but it didn't allow me to capture those intricate behaviours, that weaving and meandering we would expect in a crowd. So to address this, I created two further models, one of a pavement and the second of a crossroads, to capture those very intricate giving way and overtaking. But again, I needed some specific variables to capture those behaviours. So starting again with the population demographics, so I had different types of people in the model, varying their walking speeds, and then specifically I needed to include what I've termed as patience level. So this is the amount of time you'll wait behind someone before you get frustrated that they're walking slower than you and move around them. So that creates that weaving and meandering we'd expect. And then specifically for the crossroads, I included an exit split percentage. So this meant I could alter which direction people exited in, whether they went east or whether they went south. And that meant we could change how many interactions were occurring, how busy it was at the junction. And then finally, including population density, which was a better way of capturing how busy or quiet the area was. But where do we find the numbers behind these rules? So for things like population demographics, it's quite easy. You can look at the Office for National Statistics or the World Bank, and for most of the major cities across the world, you can find the population makeup. So for example, in cities like Tokyo, you'll find that there's much greater numbers of OAPs, and in cities like Slough in the UK, you'll find there's many more children. And we needed to understand whether it mattered if there was different numbers of people in the model. But for things like walking speeds, it was a little bit more complicated. There's actually lots of literature out there that tells us what speeds people might walk at. And what's interesting is most models currently use a value of 3 miles per hour, but you can see from the graph, not many people can actually achieve this figure. In fact, we can discount the orange and the purple lines on the graph because here people turned up to do a test. So they knew they were going to have to walk as fast as possible. So those speeds are not actually probably an everyday speed we could achieve. But you'll see there's quite a nice correlation between the other studies. And this allowed me to come up with some figures for the different population types we'd chosen. And you can see here that it's only the male adults I've assigned that 3 mile per hour walking speed, and everyone else's walking speeds have been reduced compared to current models. So what results did I achieve? So in terms of the Newcastle city centre model, we found that there was increases of up to 70% in evacuation time when we compared it to a simpler model that just had a 3 mile per hour walking speed. And in order to do this, I needed to include population demographics, varied walking speeds, different group sizes, and then applied a walking speed ratio to those groups. In terms of the pavement, again, we saw the average travel times increase, this time by around 78% when we compared it to a simpler model. To do this, we needed those population demographics and the varied walking speeds again, but we also needed the specific variables of patience level and population density. And then finally, in terms of the crossroads, this is where we saw the largest increases in travel times, in some cases by up to 238% when we compared it to the 3 mile per hour walking model. And this was due to the congestion and the number of interactions that occurred within the model. And to do this, we needed all of the previous variables, but also to add in the exit split percentage. So in conclusion, we've proved that by enhancing the representation of human behaviour, we can produce more accurate predictions of evacuation time. If we want to look at smaller scale problems, such as pavements and crossroads, we need to include some additional variables to capture those intricate human behaviours, such as overtaking and giving way. And if we fail to include this representative human behaviour in our evacuation simulations, there is the potential that there will be significant increases in fatalities and injuries during a hazard event because communities cannot reach safety in the time that we've allotted for them. This research offers us the opportunity to improve our plans and prepare better, and which in turn will reduce suffering for communities across the globe.
Hi, I'm Daryl. I'm a water engineering research student, and today I'll be asking whether virtual landscapes can help us sustain living landscapes. First, take a look at this graph. It shows that since 1970, the Earth has lost 68% of its wildlife. Think about the climate crisis. The Earth is now a degree warmer than it was in pre-industrial times, and it's getting hotter. Now, the way we manage land really matters because it can either mitigate or exacerbate biodiversity loss and climate change. However, in Britain, many of our landscapes have been degraded by centuries of human activity. Yet it's hard for us to recognize this because to us, landscapes seem eternal and unchanging. So, what are virtual landscapes and how can they help us? Simply put, a virtual landscape is a digital model of a distinct area of land. Google Earth is the best known example of this. However, they can be created using a variety of data from satellites, aerial, and scientific data. Now, a virtual landscape gives us the power to travel through time and space. And in this way, they could give us a blueprint to manage landscapes more sustainably in the future. Allow me to demonstrate by taking you on a tour. We're going to travel through 14,000 years of history of the River Cocker catchment in the Lake District. So in 12,000 BC, much of what is now northern Britain was covered in ice. And beneath the ice, the immense weight of the glaciers is reshaping the valleys. Now, the Ice Age ended in fits and starts, but by 7,000 BC, the ice was gone, and we're left with a post-glacial landscape. And it's got some interesting features I'd like you to note. So at the top of the valley, we have a wild, meandering river. This is the Scalzone, and it feeds one of the lakes, which is the Bottomere. And Bottomere, in turn, feeds a tributary called Bottomere Dubs, which again is a meandering river, and this will move across its floodplain freely. Now, Bottomere Dubs feeds the main lake in the catchment, Cromwell Water, and that's mostly what we'll be looking at today. Now, Cromwell Water also receives water from another lake via this tributary, Park Beck. And the interesting thing about Park Beck is that it doesn't look like a single deep channel, which is what we're used to seeing today. It actually has multiple channels, and that's quite different from what we'll see later. So over the centuries, the climate warmed and it supported bigger and bigger vegetation. And eventually we ended up with a wildwood around 3000 BC. Now this was extensive and it covered the catchment from the valley floors to the tops of all but the highest mountains. And it looked like this for a very long time. And then by 1,000 years ago, people had started farming the area in earnest. And they started by clearing trees from the lowest, the valley bottoms, which were the most fertile for farming. Now, over the next few centuries, this had a really big impact. And by 1799, the landscape that we recognize today had largely been created. So we're left with very little woodland. And we also noticed that the rivers, which were once these sort of wild, untamed rivers, have really been modified by people. So the Scalzone, the river is now a straightened ditch, effectively. And we've seen the same sort of thing, although less drastically, at Bottomere Dubs and Park Beck as well. So we're already seeing the ways that humans had modified the rivers, the lakes, and the landscape by 200 years ago. Now, around about the same time, people were also starting to look at the environment in a new way, and the Romantics came to the Lake District. And for example, J.M.W. Turner came and he painted this this beautiful picture of Bottomere and Cromwell. And the landscape hasn't really changed too much since then. However, By the late 1880s, the growing industrial towns of Cockermouth and Workington were in desperate need of a supply of clean water. Now, two engineers came to the area and they decided that Cromwell water would be a really great source of this water. So what they did was they built two timber weirs across the outlet of the lake. And although these weirs were small, they allowed the engineers to maintain a higher water level in summer and to control the flow from the lake into the River Cocker. And then the pipe took water from the lake to Cockermouth, where it was consumed. Now, the scheme was very successful. In a way, it was a victim of its own success. So within 20 years, growing water demand meant that this little scheme was no longer enough. So a new engineering scheme was built, and this consisted of a larger masonry weir. This actually did raise the level of the lake, submerging some areas of lakeshore. And over the next couple of decades, even more engineering was done. So we see the building of a wall alongside the lake, and also the canalization or the concrete lining of that park beck, which, remember, had once had these multiple channels and been a really interesting river system. They turned that into a flume effectively. Now, in the present day, the area is a very popular part of the Lake District National Park and is visited by tens of thousands of people every year. We can appreciate already that the landscape is the product of both natural and human forces. The water supply from Cromwell has served very well for over 100 years now, but United Utilities, the water company for the northwest of England, have recently been building an alternative pipeline to supply the towns of West Cumbria. So in just a couple of years, this will no longer be needed. And the question is left, well, what do we do with this sort of artificial engineering structure? So one of the things I've been looking into is what would happen if the weir were removed. And we can visualize that here. So if we skip forward into 2030 and imagine the weir has been removed, what we see is that the lake level declines and it slightly shrinks, especially around the shallow lake shores. And it's going to take a little bit of time for those newly exposed gravels to be revegetated. Another thing that United Utilities are considering is whether to remove the concrete lining of the park beck. And this over time would allow the beck to re-meander itself and take on a more natural form, which would be great for wildlife. So those are just some things we can look at in this catchment, but we could also use virtual landscapes to think about the effects of climate change, perhaps lower lake levels in summer, or bigger winter floods. Or we could also think in other areas about whether rewilding of the uplands were appropriate and what that might look like. So virtual landscape could be a brilliant tool for really helping us to understand what that might all look like. So I'm currently carrying out a study to test whether virtual landscapes can indeed help us to encourage sustainable landscape. And I'd like to present some preliminary results. So it looks like virtual landscapes can change the way that participants think about the landscape. Probably the biggest effect is that after having seen something like you've seen today, they consider the landscape less natural. They can change participants' attitudes towards renaturalization, with some people becoming more supportive of removing the weir or removing the concrete lining from park beck. Other people don't like the idea and they like the status quo, and that's fine. But what this does at least allow is for misconceptions to be cleared up. For example, removing the weir won't drain the Cromwell water. It will still be a beautiful lake. And finally, whether participants support renaturalization or not, this tool does seem to be able to give people with differing opinions a sort of common basis within which they can discuss those opinions with other people. Thank you for listening. I look forward to your questions.
Hello, and thank you there to our three speakers for some really excellent talks. We've now got a live question and answer session, which will last for about the next 25 minutes. As a reminder, if you do have any questions, you can ask them via the YouTube live chat or through Twitter. So we've had a couple of some questions from the audience through the live chat first. So we're going to go around our three speakers in order. So the first question to you, Annachiara, is where did you first come across these types of 3D modeling techniques?
Hi. So the first time I came across with the manufacturing, let's say, of 3D models made of hydrogel, but without the 3D printing technique, was during my master's thesis here in Newcastle University. And as soon as I started my PhD, so afterwards, after my master's thesis, I started to perform 3D bioprinting, extruding hydrogels loaded with cells with the bioprinter that I showed in my talk. While, for example, for thermoplastic polymers, I used this bioprinter that I introduced in the talk, but even other printers that are in our mechanical engineering labs. But yeah, mainly all the techniques were during my, I learned all about them during my PhD.
Okay, thank you very much. The next question is for Beth. So do existing models generally overestimate or underestimate evacuation times that occur during real disasters? And this is a question from Claire.
Hi, thanks for the question. So generally we find that the existing models underestimate the evacuation times, and that's why we've said that there's a potential for these additional fatalities and injuries because people can't evacuate in time. And that's all caused by using this single 3 mile per hour walking speed, because by assuming everyone can walk that fast, we then underestimate the time it'll take everyone to achieve safety.
And what sort of difference would you get? What sort of level of underestimation? Is it like a little bit, or is it twice the time, or?
So it starts at around 45% difference, and that's just by including some very simple population demographics. So there are some different types of people, so some OAPs, some children, and then some adults, and including the walking speeds. But then when we start to add in things like different group sizes and applying a walking speed ratio, that's when we start to see some really big changes in evacuation time. So that's more like your 70% difference.
Okay, thank you very much. So the next question is for Daryl. This one's from Russell, which is how can virtual landscapes respond to the climate crisis?
Yes, good question. Climate crisis, something I mentioned at the beginning. And then I talked about my study, which is really focused around lake and river restoration. And yes, so climate change impact is something we can definitely explore using virtual landscapes. Some work has been done on this over the last, say, 20, 25 years, using probably much simpler models. So people have tried to construct sort of stills, very basic blocky models, and use them to kind of try to educate people. And I think there's a few problems with that. So one is that they're just not very realistic. And another problem is that they're not interactive. And actually, I think the idea of just trying to sort of throw information at people in a decision that they need to be involved in is probably not really the best approach. And I think we could do better now. So I think this technology opens up those sort of avenues. I'm really biased towards lakes and rivers. So off the top of my head, I'm thinking climate change impacts would be sort of making more extreme rainfall in winter in Britain, as well as some drier summers. So those are things that we can model in terms of lake levels. And we could also model the vegetation changes as well. So think about, you know, some of the dry weather we had this year. Think about how the landscape looked. It looked really dry and parched. And that might become a permanent feature of our landscape. So we could definitely look at that in more detail. But we could also look at things like sea level rise and maybe farming changes, you know, if we're growing different crops. So yeah, lots of potential to explore that.
The environment that you were looking at here was quite a rural environment. Have you would you be able to model the effect of climate change, for example, on a more urban environment, which is perhaps more immediately relevant to many people?
Yeah, it's a good question. It'll be certainly more challenging. So yeah, there's much more going on in the city. So I think yes, but the level of work it would require for a modeler would be much greater. And I guess I haven't thought too much about that. I actually think that the level of change you might see in a city visually might actually be a lot less. So it might be a less interesting exercise. You know, how much is a building going to change in warmer weather? Probably not very much. However, you might want to think about, you know, if it got really hot in Britain and we started being like Spain, where we painted buildings white, you know, maybe that's something we could start to visualize.
Okay, thank you very much for that excellent question. Answer, sorry. So the next question is for Annachiara. This is a question about your motivation, which is, how did you decide that healthcare will be your focus in your work? And was this driven by external factors like patients, or just because you happen to be interested and have a fascination with medicine and the technology associated with it?
Well, this is a hard one, let's say. So I think the interest in healthcare is just something I've always been driven by. And to be honest, we can see how much it is important to deepen the research in the healthcare area in this moment in particular. So I think it's just something that, in my opinion, has always been very important. So I was always thinking I need to do something to help. I need to do something for the future. I have even always been, because I'm a biomedical engineer, so I'm always been fascinated with the idea of mixing engineering and medicine in general, because I think that sometimes there is the need of a strong mind, strong engineering mind behind some medicine application, and like even the other way around. So I think it's a good combination. And yeah, that's it. Like, what I would really like and what I would love is to obtain something that can be useful for the future and that could even avoid, in my case, a lot of animal tests, because the idea of having this model is to do lots of tests in the lab without experiencing trial on animals. So yeah, that's mainly my motivation.
Okay. Thank you very much for that answer. So we'll move on now to Beth. So this is a question: do you think that it will be beneficial for the general public to have access to these types of simulations, perhaps as an awareness or a training tool, so I presume to support their own emergency exit sort of response?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So there definitely would be some benefits, and like a huge part of disaster management planning is about what people would do and how they would react. So if people were better prepared and they already kind of had a plan of action, that would then help emergency services, because they'd know, well, roughly 50% of people have said they will evacuate and this is where they will go to safety. So we know then things like logistics, so how to get enough water and food to those evacuation centres. But there's also the worry that if you release things to the public, the panic it can cause by people thinking, oh, but my house is going to get flooded, or if there was a wildfire, my house is going to burn down, sort of thing. So it's a balancing act to make sure that we keep the public informed and that they can make a good decision without causing panic. Other countries like Japan are really well drilled with what to do, and have a really good protocol in place, and citizens would know if an earthquake happens or a tsunami a warning is issued, they know where to go and when and how to get there.
Okay, thank you very much. So moving on now to Daryl again. This question, I'm quite sure I understand, so let's try this and see whether it works. So are these greater expressed fears from public respondents regarding flooding potential from a renaturalized landscape? Yes, I did understand it. Hopefully you too.
Okay. So the simple answer is I don't know yet. So I mentioned at the end, I'm actually just carrying out a study into using this with different stakeholders at the moment, and that's something I've really got in mind. So I'm recruiting people with a particular interest in flooding to see how they respond to that. So I'll be able to tell you more in a couple of months. If I were to speculate, I think, yeah, that could be an issue. Certainly flooding is a really big issue for people in Cockermouth. So that's a flood hotspot. And so, yes, people will be very sensitive about that for good reasons. I suspect there will be a lot of questions about it. And I guess I don't really know how I don't know what will come from that. So I think basically it's a good tool for opening up a discussion. The tool can't tell you when you're going to flood, and it probably by itself can't tell you whether a renaturalized landscape will make flooding more or less likely. So for that, we're really relying on more sophisticated flood models, the outputs of which I could put into the virtual landscape and look at it that way.
Okay, thank you very much. So the next question again for Annachiara, we're going around in circles here. Can you share with us the next stage of next stage plan for your research? So the question really is, how do you see the route from here to having a clinical impact?
Okay, so yeah, we'll start from what I'm going to do now. Like, this is what I understood, like what I'm going to do now and what I expect from my model. So what I'm going to do now basically is to finish my model. So to finish my healthy model, to conclude it with the superficial layer, that it's something that I still didn't do. But what I'm mainly focusing on now is how to obtain the pathological model, because the main idea of my work is to have a healthy model of osteochondral tissue, have a pathological model of osteochondral tissue, use this pathological model to test some therapeutic treatments. So how to obtain this pathological model, it's something that I'm optimizing at the moment. I don't want to go in depth. If you want, I can go in depth, but there are different ways. I just chose one way that, in my opinion, was the more reliable, that is to obtain this pathological model in a chemical way. It means to add some molecules that are kind of emulating the in vivo pathological situation. So what is going to happen is that the extracellular matrix of the cartilage and even to the subchondral bone is going to degrade. So that's the idea of the pathological model. It's not easy because there are lots of things to optimize. After that, the idea is to understand how we can, first of all, how can we validate this model? And second, another thing is how to use this model for therapeutic treatments. So I have some ideas for the therapeutic treatments. And again, if you want, I can share with you these ideas. And for the validation, I'm using a validation model because like each model needs to be validated. Otherwise, it doesn't have any sense. So I prepared the validation model using a clinically approved technique that was approved by the NICE, and so this will be like my, let's say, my control. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. So next question for Beth. So this is a question about the users of your software and your simulations. It seems that your evacuation simulations would be valuable to emergency relief organizations. Can you see them being translated for use by smaller businesses and organizations?
So yes, I think that's the ultimate aim of this research, is to kind of get it to a point where it can be commercialized, and then we can get it out to those organizations that could really benefit from its use. Obviously, when I first started my research, it was hard to kind of get anyone to listen to you and kind of say, I've got an idea and this is going to work. But now that I'm getting to the end of my PhD and my research is being published and proved that there are results and there are differences, it now makes it easier to go back towards other companies that have already got software and say, I can help you improve this. I've already proven in one set of research that this works and there are benefits of it. Or the other alternative is to try and commercialize it myself, ultimately winning some more research funding to keep taking this forward. I think that there needs to be a link up with a logistics model first. I think that will be a key role for emergency relief organisations, because they need to know where do we need to send people, where do we need to send relief. So I think that will play a key role as well. So I think there's more research to be done, but I do think that it could be commercialised in the future.
Okay, thank you very much. Moving on now to Daryl. I think this is a question from somebody who lives in Cumbria, at least, which is, can you model the changes in flood risk to Cockermouth from the changes such as removing the dam and re-meandering the stream?
Yes, that can be done. Whether I can do it as part of my project is a different question. So it's something that I wouldn't be able to do within the virtual landscape. So that will really be a separate exercise. And that involves all kinds of hydrodynamic equations. It's just a completely different type of model. Yes, it can be done. Those models do exist. And so remeandering, in theory, you might expect it to have a mitigating effect on downstream flood risk. However, the effects of that might be quite small in such a big catchment with such powerful events. The amount of water that comes out of that catchment when there's a storm is huge. So I think remeandering a few rivers, as much as it has ecological benefits, will probably have a very marginal effect on the sort of downstream flood risk, unfortunately. In terms of removing the weir, yeah, so that's a more complicated question, I think, and again, it would need to be a separate exercise. I think there could, it really depends how the design is done. I've been on that site so many times and spoke to so many engineers about that. I think if it's done sensitively, it could have a small mitigating effect downstream, but that really needs to be modeled very, very well before the dam's removed, so we have some confidence in that.
Okay, thank you very much for that answer. I think at this point we have a few more questions, but I think in the interest of time, I'm probably going to close there. So I'd like to thank all of the speakers again. They are Annachiara Scalzone, Beth Barnes, and Daryl Hughes, for their really, really fascinating talks and their fascinating research. And I'm looking forward really very much to coming back to this in a few years' time to see where the research has gone to and how it's developed. And also, of course, as these are new voices, to see how their careers develop in the future as well. So thank you again to you all, and I hope that everybody has enjoyed the talks and enjoyed the answer session today. And thank you very much for coming.